So I wanted to do something a little bit. We're sort of shifting gear here a little bit, right? We've up till now we've been mostly focused on technologies, and I think we want to start to shift thinking a little bit to looking at where these technologies are currently being used in city applications. A lot of we sort of went through a phase early on of realizing that cities in most cases saw services as they were very happy if they had one, right? Like the parking app or the transit app. Now they're starting to move to having a group of applications, and that's, I think, where the technology we're talking about starts to become really critical. And a good place to sort of see some of that is in some of these testbed areas. So I'd ask John Fink, who's running the Digital City Testbed Center at Portland State University, to sort of give us a bit of an overview of what he's been doing with the testbeds that they're looking at, and then we can have a discussion about how the technologies we're talking about might fit into that. So it's a little bit of a change here that we're not talking about specifically technologies, but I think it's a progression I was looking to try and get here. So John, if you don't mind, if you could pick it up from there.
Sure. Thanks, Wilf, and thank you all for the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint that's somewhat of a generic description of the center that we set up here in the last 6 months. My hope is that we'll get to the end and have some discussion along the lines of what's been talked about in the previous sessions about data issues, data sovereignty, security, and so on. So this center was launched at Portland State last October with internal funding. The president here wanted to have a couple of centers of excellence, so he funded this one and one about homelessness at a level of $500K a year for 3 years. And so just a couple of these slides are pretty standard. Just what are we referring to as a digital city or smart city? And not going to spend any time on this. Number of positive attributes of bringing technology into cities, and a number of negative ones as well. And it seems like these days there's more and more attention on the negative and less on the positive. And we all have examples we can cite of those. So that we tried to summarize the challenges that smart cities bring to the public and to different audiences. And so the three are: how do the cities themselves evaluate all of the options that they're faced with? How does the public assess which of these are positive and which are not? And how do companies align what they're doing with the interests of the cities and the public? And just one slide on Portland State. So most of you who are elsewhere outside of Portland don't really know about Portland State. We're a urban serving university in downtown Portland, typical of this kind of university in the US, where you have a public university system in a state, and there'll be a flagship university, which in our case would be University of Oregon, a land-grant university, which here would be Oregon State, and then an urban serving one, which is in the downtown area that has a very applied research focus and tends to be where first-generation students go. Schools like ours are particularly good at partnering because we don't have the resources to do things on our own like the others do. So given that, we're not a place that companies are going to look to say, this is where the cutting edge of technology is going to happen. That's just not who we are. What we're better at are the policy and social science aspects of smart cities. And so that's what we're emphasizing in terms of what our faculty are doing as part of this initiative. But as I'll talk about in a minute, we're trying to position this as a regional initiative that involves Portland and Seattle and Vancouver and the universities in those three cities. We'll get to that in a minute. The main theme of our program is the idea of using campuses, single owner campuses, as test sites for smart city innovation. And the advantages of campuses is that they have, in most cases, simpler decision making than the city does on its own. So before technology or policies are deployed into neighborhoods and into business districts, our suggestion is to do these on campuses initially. So the three campuses. somebody's, if you could mute, that would be great. The three campuses that we're starting with are the Portland State campus, seen on the left on the slide, the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry campus on the upper right, and the University of British Columbia campus on the lower right. So these three campuses are quite different in size and in structure. The sizes are mentioned in the corners of the images. So Portland State is about 55 acres. It's completely mixed in with the city. When you're on the campus, you can't really tell when you're on it and when you're off of it. Turning to University of British Columbia, it's the opposite. First of all, it's much larger. It's almost 1,000 acres. It sits by itself on the end of the peninsula. It's basically its own city, but the city of Vancouver, which you can see in the background of the slide, is adjacent to it. And the reason that we're using UBC is because they have been using their campus to test out a number of policies and initiatives, mostly related to sustainability, for about a decade. And I have a part-time position up there for 3 years, which is making it, which is why we're trying to incorporate them. And then the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, at the moment, as you can see, there's a couple of buildings, which are the museum, surrounded by parking lots. But the site is about to be turned into a mixed-use development with a number of large buildings over the next 5 to 10 years. Wilf and I are both directly involved in the development of that site, and they are quite open to including technology into the buildings that go on and the district itself. And so we see this as a greenfield opportunity. So at the moment, the three circles on the left, Portland State, University of British Columbia, and the museum, are where we're starting. But we're also in discussions with University of Washington. There are 3 campuses, and also Microsoft in Redmond in the Seattle area as additional campuses that we would like to expand to. And then we're also in discussions with the Oregon Health and Science University, about a mile from Portland State, Portland Airport, and the Oregon Zoo, as very contrasting kinds of campuses. They share the attribute of having single owners and relatively quick decision-making, but very different clienteles. And part of the reason to include a science museum and a zoo, as well as universities, is that one of our goals is to be active in educating the public about smart city questions and smart city issues. So this slide, this is the wordiest slide, and this is basically laying out the rationale for why we're doing what we're doing. So just to go through it quickly, the idea is to test before deployment, but only to do that in partnership with cities. If we were just trying things out on campuses by ourselves, that really wouldn't serve the purpose that we're aiming for. The city has to see this as valuable, the adjacent city or the surrounding city. And so we're working very closely with the city of Portland, and also in Vancouver with the cities of Vancouver and Surrey, which is the largest suburb of Vancouver, and to a lesser extent right now with the city of Seattle and Redmond and Bellevue. The campuses are academic, but also corporate and also nonprofits. We're trying to network a number of campuses together because they have different boundary conditions, but we're focusing on the Cascadia region of Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver because although these are separate metros, they have a lot of similarities. And so there's a starting position that's similar in all 3 places. They're pretty tech-savvy cities with quite a bit of tech industry and public that is quite policy savvy. So especially in Portland, if you have some idea or the city wants to try something out, there's a lot of feedback from the public, which is not always the case in other areas. One of our goals is to take the technologies that are being developed, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that have products that they are trying out in cities. These are generally not interoperable, and I think this is one of the issues that this forum has been discussing. It's one thing if a city is going to have one parking app or one transit app, and people don't move from one metro to another. But as we move around, it would be nice to not have to download a whole bunch of new things and figure out if they work together. And so one of the goals that we have on these campuses is to start to look at some of this interoperability and some of the replicability as well, the replication. I mentioned that at Portland State, we're focusing on the social science and policy side, but we're working with people in computer science at University of Washington and University of British Columbia, and also at Portland State, and some of the technology people in engineering at all three universities. The faculty that we're working with are at Portland State, University of Washington, University of British Columbia, also Oregon State, Arizona State, and Carnegie Mellon. And we're certainly open to including more. We're trying to stay focused at an early stage, however. The priorities that we're focusing on are ones that are of interest to the communities that we're working with. So this city platform group, this forum that's been going on for 6 months or so, we're very interested in the questions that have come up in the previous sessions here. And our hope is that this community would see this initiative as an asset that where we could work together. And then in terms of the specific research topics that we're looking at least initially, we're focusing on public education, which I mentioned before, also resilience, particularly seismic, but also climate resilience, because Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver are at some point going to experience the worst natural disaster in the history of our two countries, of Canada and the US. Hopefully that won't be in my lifetime, but it could be any minute. So the seismic risk is quite significant here, and there's some technology that can help with that. And then the other topic that we're focusing pretty heavily on is accessibility. So how can technology help people who have limitations in vision or mobility or hearing or cognition? How do they negotiate their way through cities? This is maybe 10% of the population of any city is affected by this, but there are a lot of new technologies that are coming along. And the smart city technology discussions and the accessibility technology discussions have not overlapped that much up until recently. We see this as a big opportunity because every city and every campus has to have a strategy for helping these populations out. And then on a technical level, we're interested in data security issues, the data sovereignty issues which come out of these discussions, and privacy. I think, again, every week there are new frightening issues that are coming to light. I just listened to the New York Times podcasts this week. That actually was last week. They had two about China and the video surveillance going on in China and how that's being used to suppress minorities there. And just listening to that, I felt like I want to just quit this whole business. But I think we all have the responsibility and the opportunity to make sure that those issues are being discussed along with new technologies. So to develop these campuses, we're talking with a number of large companies to help out with the basic infrastructure that's necessary to make these campuses appealing test beds for small and large companies and for cities to try things out. And then we've been in discussion with a number of smaller companies and initiatives to see if some of these can be tried out on these campuses. And this is not to say that this set of applications are the best ones or the only ones. We realize there are dozens and hundreds and thousands of these emerging, and each of you has ones that you're working with. These are the ones that we happen to have encountered in Portland and Seattle and Vancouver. And what we're trying to do with these initially is to have some co-location of some of these on our campuses. So starting with the Portland State campus, this is just a Google map blow up of part of the campus. These are some of the topics and issues that we would like to be able to address using some of these emerging applications. So seismic preparedness, restricted mobility, restricted vision. There's quite a lot of interest in Vision Zero. That's one of the main smart city applications in many cities, how to reduce the number of fatalities from pedestrians and bicycles bumping into vehicles or vice versa. Outdoor air quality, There's lots of new sensors being deployed, and the question is, which of these are cheap enough but also accurate enough to supplement the governmental measurements that might be going on where you have one or two measurements for a metro. Indoor air quality is increasingly of interest, and the interactions between indoor and outdoor air quality. Building occupancy, just how many people are present in different parts of a building. We're working with a company out of University of British Columbia, which uses the pings on Cisco routers to calculate how many people are in a given room. That can then be used to adjust the HVAC systems and the lighting and other things like that. And then public education. So these are some of the applications that we're looking to deploy on the Portland State campus in this corridor over the next few months, over the summer. And part of the idea is to just see how these work together, also to put some signage up to educate the public about what we're doing, to raise some questions or invite questions about security, about privacy, about other things that people might have, so that we can get those dialogues going here. And then also just to see what data sets are being generated by these applications and see how we can pool those together. Portland, as I can't recall if we've had a discussion in this forum on the Portland Urban Data Lake, the Puddle data system, which is being developed by the city of Portland along with Microsoft and Esri and Cloudera and Clairvoyant. So 4 companies working with the city to create this database system. We'd like to see if we could just take our smaller data sets from the campus, or eventually the campuses, and put those into the databases to just start playing around with them and seeing what's feasible. So these corridors, and that part of the idea here is to have this corridor on the Portland State campus and then to try to replicate that on the University of British Columbia campus and the museum campus and then the other ones. But also for others who have other campuses that they're working on, can we get some dialogue going and see what's working, what lessons can we learn from comparisons across multiple sites? So our goals here, again, are to educate the public about smart cities, test some of these data issues using these relatively small data sets that will be generated by this technology, look for interoperability, and evaluate different boundary conditions. Just to go back to our center here, on the left, these are some of the departments that are participating from Portland State. So it's pretty interdisciplinary. And then we have an advisory board that has representatives from the groups on the right. And what we're hoping, and what I'm hoping out of this conversation is to expand what we're doing to a larger set of players, particularly those in the Pacific Northwest, just because we like the idea of trying to have a bit of geographic focus, but also to other initiatives that are going on elsewhere. And on the left, the last bullet, we have a representative from our School of Art and Design. And what do they do about smart cities? They help us develop really nice logos. So with that, I'll stop, and I welcome any questions, or Wilf, if you want to add some other issues.
That was great. Thank you. That was really helpful to get the background. I've seen some of this before, but it gets better every day. So thank you. I think the thing that's really exciting here is the opportunity to test out the two things that I think we struggle with most. The first one, the interoperability between the services. There are not a lot of cities that are really trying to deal with that yet, but they're all asking the question. And then the interoperability between sites. So, you know, the development of the PSU site and the various different services in close proximity and how they would potentially work together, and then making sure that those same services and those same applications could be interoperable as you move from PSU to OMSI to Vancouver, BC. So if we can tackle those as sort of early challenges for the city data platform, then I think we're starting to get in the right place. So did anybody have questions for John?
Yeah, so you mentioned, security and privacy a couple times. So I have kind of two questions. One, are you planning on any sort of proactive assessment or, pen testing of any sort to, determine the security or privacy aspects of these smart city capabilities? And I guess the second part of my question would be, are there any plans to kind of assess uh, the kind of cybersecurity solutions within this space, if that differentiation makes sense?
Yes. Who is this? I don't have the list in front of me.
This is Peter Wong with the Soder Group. I help support the Department of Homeland Security, Science and Technology Directorate, and I'm also involved with the Cybersecurity and Privacy Advisory Committee in the GCTC
Great
program.
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, we would like to do those things, and our ability to do that will depend on having partners who see the value in using these sites. I should have said, I think I did say at the end, that one of our goals is to make this set of campuses available and of interest to people like all of you. Particularly if you see some proposal opportunities where having access to this would add value, we'd like to get engaged. So we do have some people with some of the interests that you mentioned, but I would rely on the various networks that we're a part of to bring in that expertise more specifically. So some of the people who are on this call, Portland has a pretty good set of cybersecurity companies and programs going on. Portland State has a few people, but I would turn it back and say we're very interested in doing that. We would look to people like all of you to define what the best ways of doing that would be.
Yeah, let me add to that a little bit. So, Peter, Tosny was one of the companies that John had on his slides, and Tosny does have a DHS grant at the moment to look at the privacy component. And one of the previous presentations here on this forum, they gave a discussion of sort of their high level view of this. And so the intention is that we will work on a technology, that hopefully is pushing forward our collective agenda around the smart city platform. We've got a couple of ideas about where to start, mostly I think around transportation, and test some things out, but we want to do it in a way that's very much in line with the IES city framework and sort of start that path. So that's part of wanting to go down this line, right? How do we start to work together as a group to establish a common platform and move it forward? And so I think this is a good opportunity to start that.
I would just add that we've had some conversations in the last week with PNNL about their interest in some of these issues. So they're our local DOE lab. So there may be some opportunities there as well.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
Hi, Wilf. This is Brigitta. I'm wondering about identity management. Is there a role here for any common use of identity management across all of these sites, or is this something that we could think about down the road?
Wilf, you can answer more detail. I would say that we have been talking specifically about the museum site for some of this, because that site is going to be changed so much, and the museum is mostly concerned about how do they make sure that during the development, parents can still bring their kids to the museum. We are talking about some sort of identification or data that the visitors would share with the museum and with us to get a better idea of their transportation interests and options, and that we would set this up so that they would share their data in exchange for getting some kind of a discount or something along those lines. I don't know that we've we're at the point yet of thinking of having systems that cut across the multiple campuses just because we're at such an early stage, but that would certainly be a logical way to go.
Yeah, and let me add to that. So, I mean, we talked about the overall platform requiring an identity as part of it. I'm not sure yet whether one identity or whether interoperable identities is quite the right way to go yet. Requiring a blockchain identity for even small transactions is a heavyweight component, though having a truly self-sovereign identity that backs up all the other identities in the same way as, we have a birth certificate, and from that you can get passports, and from that you can get driver's licenses, and from it. So I don't know whether it's one identity or whether it is a sort of cascading set of interoperable identities, but I think it's absolutely critical. And I think individuals need identities. I think services need identities. I think organizations like cities and OMSI need their own identities. And then this idea that that an individual can create a secure transaction with a service or with another individual. So I think that is at the core of this, and those four elements we talked about before: the identity, the personal data store, or the data store associated with that identity, the transaction record, and the mechanism to have intelligent transactions or digital contracts between them are still the key elements that we need to have. So I absolutely think we need a definition of what that interoperable identity is, and clearly we want that identity to work between Portland State University, OMSI, and Vancouver, BC, and then as we grow this out. So I'm not sure whether it's we have to agree to an identity, or if we have to agree to a way in which identity is expressed and checked, so as a transaction can be done at a level of security that's reasonable for that transaction.
Great, thanks.
Other questions?
Hi, this is Thomas Doherty. John, great talk, and I just hope we can continue to discuss how the Testbed can interact with this Thriving Communities initiative we have to, health and well-being across the lifespan, equity, environmental sustainability, and things like that. My question was, have you all created any user stories or individual stories of people within the communities, within the campuses, to better flesh out how individuals are going to plug into this? I'm thinking about lifespan. A lot of these people will be younger students, for example. Have you done any user stories yet, or more qualitative stories of the users and how they're interacting with all these larger systems?
No. What I will say is that one of the disadvantages of using campuses as test beds is that most campuses are not particularly representative of the city as a whole in terms of their population. Portland State is actually relatively good in that regard, because we do have a fairly diverse community right around it. And rather than, so part of the goal here was to have community groups that we could bring in to give us feedback about what's going on the campuses before things get deployed more broadly. But we're not going to be doing a lot of that on our own through this center, because Portland State and the city of Portland have so many other groups that are already engaged in these kinds of discussions that we want to just tap into those rather than being a burden on those neighborhood groups saying, here's yet another thing we want you to comment on. I think that what may come out of that down the road are the kinds of descriptions that you're talking about to make it more individually oriented, especially as we try to help people understand what the positives and negatives of bringing technology into cities could be.
Yeah, I think it's right. We don't have a formal structure of this yet, but those dialogues have started. So in the discussions we've had with OMSI around their membership and about the travel problem that is there. There's an understanding that there are a wide range of different communities that come to OMSI, and a discussion about what it is we would need to do. And it's a lot more than just providing public transit. What would we need to do to encourage those people, for example, not to bring their vehicles to that site, because we want to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicle trips. That's also a city problem, and it's also an OHSU problem. It's probably also a PSU problem. So the concept of defining the individual and what it is that motivates that individual, and how the city testbed platform, right, the platform we're building, could help inform those dialogues and provide incentives for those shifts, I think is a key piece of what we want to do here. And then there are a couple of folks that are engaged here. John, you have somebody who's doing work on in this area out of PSU, and of course Richard Beckwith has done a lot of work here looking at the individuals and how they react to the technology and how they engage the technology. I don't know if you want to say anything, Richard, but I think some of the work you've done around things like autonomous vehicles has been pretty much leading edge here.
Yeah, I think that, we are really interested in this, and we actually typically do wind up doing these kind of personas where we talk about the individual users and why, how they interact with the system. But I think until we get a little further along, I don't think we'll wind up doing that. What we're doing now is going out and working with people in communities and community groups, representatives of community groups, in order to sort of get a general outline of what this is going to look like. But I totally imagine that we will wind up doing things just like what you asked.
Other questions?
Going once.
If you want to give me the control, John, I will just let go of the control, and I'll pick it up and bring up another slide that we wanted to discuss here.
That's assuming that I know how to do that.
Yeah? Right at the top in the middle. Yeah, you got it. Perfect. Perfect. Let me see if I can do this. Cool. I think I got it. So this is the slide that, let's see, let's put this full screen too so as we can see it. So this is a slide we've been talking about with sort of the four components I just mentioned: the data store, the identity, the contract, and the transaction record. So I think what we've been talking about here is, are there some instances, and these are some that we know about in the Northwest, but I'd be really interested in a discussion about other opportunities to do this. But what we're really looking for to get this right is some instances where there are multiple services in a fairly tight location. So if we're testing out the interoperability between different services and how people interact with that and how to make them work together in a seamless way. And also the multiple site interoperability, the fact that if you have this transaction infrastructure, if you have this common platform, is this sufficient that you should be able to get on a plane in Portland and fly to British Columbia and use the same applications? If you've got a multimodal transit app, you turn up there and it functions in the same way as Google Maps can bring up, transit options in pretty much any city. So it's what's the minimum of that platform that works here, both to give an interoperability between services and an interoperability between locations. And you do need, therefore, to be able to, to answer Brigitte's question, we do need to be able to say your identity will interoperate, right? It may be a lesser identity that's used to rent a bike from Bike Town than it is to purchase a piece of land. But the cascading nature of those identities and the way in which they interoperate is common. And so you can say, in the same way as a credit card can interoperate or a driver's license can interoperate, we need that level of digital interoperability in the identity. So this is sort of the thing we're building, and I wanted to touch on it because I think this is one of the main pieces we would like to build underneath all of the test beds we have here and all of the services we have. And I think we're a long way from being able to do that, though I would say the place which is most active from our perspective at the moment is around transportation. There's a recognition that if we do want to start to do things like reduce the number of single occupancy vehicle trips to any of these sites, either the 3 sites that John mentioned or the ones that we have in the future, like OHSU or others, all of whom have this problem that they're overloaded with parking, and it's causing problems for them. That having a wallet like this that works both to deliver services and incentives to use those services, and potentially provides data back to the offerer of the service about the use of that service, it would be an incredible asset. And the more we talk to these groups, the more they're saying yes, we want to do this. So I think we have a starting point for how to test out how something like this would work. I think that the other piece that I wanted to cover here, and Jacob and I have been sort of working on trying to put together what the next step is that we have to do collectively, right? So it'd be a bunch of things that we can work on individually, Jacob in Baltimore, John and I here in Portland and other places. But how do we get together and make sure that what we're doing is meeting our objective of a unified, interoperable, at least at the national level, preferably at the international level as we start to engage, with Byware and others. What are the things we need to do? I think, I don't know if you want to talk through this slide a little bit, Jacob. I thought your points on trust were key to this. You want to pick this up for a little?
Sure, I can speak for a little bit. For everyone that doesn't know me, I'm Jacob from Baltimore. I work with a number of the university partners around here and have my hands in a number of things. Through that experiences, we've kind of isolated the idea that Wolf already explained. There's a common, probably technical vision underpinning what many in this community would find common ground on. But as we deploy, it's important, I think, it was identified that, and I think John mentioned it, and it was a focal point for PSU, of what's the social implication, and another, as an engineer, what's going to make all this work is the ability to have trust. The trust from the community that the data sovereignty works, that the privacy works, but also that those that are operating it have the best interest in mind. So I think it's important to outline first a set of goals and some principles in which maybe that this community could kind of come to some agreement on. The other was the idea of that there's a need for an open engine. We've seen in a lot of the open source communities, there's a recognition that there's an innovation engine that spins a lot faster when it's open. And that same innovation engine, I think we need to really kickstart in the municipal space. There's been a lot of activity from a lot of people, and this group is, I think, well positioned to start to bring some of that together from the various different stakeholders to really get that engine going. We might want to identify things that are common to this community and start defining this as a community, as others communities have. And so, what are those core principles? And then also, what are the tools in which we achieve both the technical aspirations of the group as well as the principles and the goals? And those tools, roughly defining them as open source, open data, open standards, giving this group some context to be able to talk to others, at the CIO level, at the policy level. That's not just about the technical.
So this is sort of a straw man. I think we'd like everybody to, think about this. So these are the right goals and the right tools and the right principles. I think the we do want to be outcome driven here, right? We want to make sure that we develop a common platform that gets very broad adoption. And I think Jacob's exactly right. Trust is the core of that, right? If there are large organizations out there that are perfectly capable of developing these kinds of platforms, and in many cases already have. The challenge is that the cities are concerned that if they become an IBM city or a GE city, then the commercial motivations of those organizations now drive most of the services that are there, right? They if it's a GE city now, it's going to be GE streetlights and other things. And actually, I think those large organizations are starting to come to realization that's very unattractive for them either. GE doesn't want to find that Austin is now a Cisco city, or that San Francisco is an IBM city. What they'd like to be able to do is to say there is a core platform that is operated as a community developed platform, with good support at all the cities, and IGE can sell streetlights to all of those cities, or IGE can sell rotating machinery to all of those cities, and IBM can sell Watson to all of those cities. So I think getting those organizations to join this entity, and I think we're making some progress there, allows them to then have a hand in what that open community developed platform is, but remain able to have commonality between the cities, so as their services interoperate and they're not customizing for each city. So we're trying to capture that in the sort of goals and tools and principles here. So any questions on that, and please feel free. I will get these posted. These are not actually up yet on the wiki, but I will get a link to the Google Drive up there, so as people can comment on these slides. But any comments?
I have a question. This is John Fink again. So I appreciate the logic here and the rationale and why this is needed. I like the analogy to Mozilla and other open source things. But thinking as a consumer, and going back to the example you gave before, Wilf, for me, Google Maps works great everywhere, or almost everywhere. I mean, and so to me, I would need, if I were not in this community and I heard that people were talking about this, I'd say, well, show me what the flaws are in what Google Maps can deliver to me in terms of transit information in every city I go to. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's about as interoperable as I could imagine having for that particular set of issues. So I'd be interested in what this group would respond to say, well, here are the things you're not seeing when you like that particular product.
So I would say Google Maps is a perfect example of what we are trying to do, right? So that to me is the ideal, and the foundational part of what made Google Maps Transit possible was GTFS.
Right.
And GTFS is a very simple, minimal interoperability layer that facilitates bringing transit data to all the applications that use GTFS, which is a lot more than Google Maps. If Google had defined that as a proprietary interface, I would bet you that not every city in the world would have said, yes, we will happily share all of our transit data in the Google format, because it'll only work for Google. What enabled it was the making available the GTFS layer, Google then adopting it, which is perfect. So once we build out this layer, I hope that it is simple and minimal, and I hope that Google and Amazon and GE and IBM adopt it, and that creates the interoperability. The challenge will be, even if it was Google that defined the smart city, Sidewalk Labs steps up and does it, my bet is that IBM and GE will say, yeah, we're not falling into that trap. We're going to go and do our own and make Google come to us. So what we're trying to do is to head that off. And I think Google Maps and GTFS is the perfect example of what we do want to achieve.
So can you get somebody from Google on these calls?
I will be very happy to get somebody from Google on these calls.
Or not, if people think that's not a good idea. I mean,
I think it absolutely is, and we are starting to build that up. If anybody on this call has contacts in there, I mean, I could chase them too, and will do. I think we're building up to this, and I think it becomes easier as a core group of people like this start to define what the goals and tools and the principles are, to go get executive level meetings at GE and IBM and others. I think, I have had discussions through the GCTC at pretty high levels with a lot of these organizations. And I think in principle, they want to join. I think they will start to ask questions like, how is this more than what we've already done as we joined, for example, the Industrial Internet Consortium, right? And I think my answer to that would be, we're not trying to reinvent IoT. What we're trying to do is to make a platform that's highly relevant to an individual community or city so as they can adopt it. They can't go in and just adopt Industrial Internet Consortium. It's not, they could say we're going to comply with it, but I think we're trying to make something that gets broad adoption in the same way as GTFS got broad adoption.
What about others?
Please invite everybody that you think is in any way interested, if they're academic, if they're government, if they're industry, right? That's what we want to do. We want to build this community out. This is intended to be the forum through which all of those players.
No, I just meant what do other people on the call think?
Oh, sorry. Good.
Hi, this is Brigitte again. Just wondering, if Google goes away for some reason, do we have a backdrop? And that's kind of the promise of these distributed systems, is we're not reliant on an individual entity like Google. What are your thoughts?
John, you going to pick that one up?
No.
I think
no basis.
I think the idea of doing this as a community is the core to answering that question, Brigitte. I think that's exactly right. If for example, and if any of these companies, I mean, let's take a big company like GE, they developed Predix. If a city were to adopt Predix, and one would have to say that if you were going to pick a proprietary platform, going with GE is as low a risk as it's going to get. But but that's still questionable for most cities. First of all, does that now alienate all the other big players that they want to bring in as competitors for the services they offer? Secondly, Predix is not a core business for GE. Their rotating machinery is. And so they may walk away from it at some point. They may say, oh, yeah, we're going to partner with Sidewalk Labs and we're going to use their platform. Or we're going to partner with Intel and use IoTivity. And now you're really stuck up, without a paddle, right? Now you've deployed all of these services and invested all this money in a platform. So I think the only way that you give a city a viable approach here is to say, this platform is not only open, but it's community developed. It's like using Django for your website or developing in Python. There is no company that if they went away would take out Django or Python, right? They're community developed and you're solid. If you're in that space, then the city feels confident. I could pick up a phone in pretty much any city in the world and find a Django programmer to update my website if I chose to do it in Django. And you need to be in the same space here. The Open Commons infrastructure, you need to be able to say, there are 6 vendors in my city. If I need to, develop a new service, I'm not stuck picking up the phone and calling GE or calling Cisco. I can call them and they will maybe offer the best service and they should compete for it, but I'm not stuck always going to that vendor. They are a viable partner and maybe the best partner, but not the only partner.
Hi, this is Scott Lewis. Just to comment about what Wilf just said. Another example of that is the the various open source foundations, the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, all of those kind of provide to their consumers guarantees of survival beyond any and all the membership.
That's what I was kind of looking at, and I don't know if anyone noticed the new Urban Computing Foundation announcement from the Linux Foundation that went out yesterday in terms of starting to make inroads into the municipal space. And I would kind of argue that something like this of some core technical principles and core commons is needed.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? I did put a whole deck together here. I think most of you've seen this one. Sakwu talked a little while ago. If you want to know a bit more about the work the NIST is doing to sort of drive the framework for this, go look for Sakwu's talk. Then we started, again, Jacob and I were sort of brainstorming a little bit about what kind of ways would we encourage membership in this, and who would we look for? I think there have been various efforts of this. John can talk about some of them. We've been members of things like the Metro Lab, and the idea of cooperation. I think there is a challenge for a lot of the cities in how they collaborate. Right, they're mostly funded by taxpayer money, and they feel that money should be spent on solving city problems locally, and so they tend to be a bit insular. We've certainly had a challenge getting them to work more openly. Metro Lab's approach was to get them to team with a university. So there's the universities are pretty good at collaborating. They often co-author papers and develop. I think something like that is good. I think another way to do it is to, rather than focus on the big cities for members, because I think they will join. And I think we want them as members, but there's actually more motivation sort of in the middle area, because many of the mid-sized cities cannot do this on their own. A lot of the bigger cities inherently want to do it on their own. They say, New York or Boston or San Francisco says, we're a unique city, we're going to build our own, and they have the resources to do it. But if you go to, around here, places like Hillsborough and Beaverton, Clackamas, those municipalities are much more likely to say, oh yeah, we got to team up to do this. So the first piece of this, and again, we're not. This is a straw man for people to contribute to. Was to say, okay, could we encourage a way in which people become members with pre-built-in partnerships, so as they have communities they can work with. John's a great example of this, because we're already starting to get a regional participation with academia and government and industry through the work that he's doing with the DCTC. So, and then the GCTC itself is starting to look at regional collaborations. And I think we want to encourage that in the membership in every way we can. So this was a sort of straw man at what we would want to do there. And then we started to think about each of those communities. What do we do? How do we, who do we go after, and what's their benefit? So this would be, what is it that we're offering to the cities and the communities who want to join versus the industry versus the academia, and what are the services that Open Commons or this group collectively offers them, from events to opportunities like this with webinars for those people to come together and share common issues, solve common problems. How do we drive education, because a lot of these cities don't fully understand what a smart city is, let alone some of the issues we're talking about here. How do we put the businesses together as a catalog of companies and services that have agreed to be interoperable, that will work towards this interface? So these were some of those. I think we created 3 slides here. Slide for the developers, why they would join. Slide for the commercial companies, and why they would join. So did you want to add to that, Jacob, and talk to that a little bit?
No, I think you hit it right on the nose there, Will.
And we have, where there are a number of these forums already. And I think some of them are on the website. I'm quite happy to start to keep a catalog of them. But in June there's a DC expo event that's run by NIST, where we can get together and talk these through. I think Jacob, you've got an event that you're working on in Europe, and then one in Baltimore, and then there's another one in Portland later this year. Did you want to talk a bit about those?
Sure. Well, so there's the two items there. One is the cross promotion in terms of building a bit of a network between the events that are going on to get some cross promotion and just start spreading the ideas. And then I can also share a little bit about the Paris work that's been going on, and why I jumped into a lot of this was the city of Paris has built a content management and workflow system that provides all of their city services. So they provide 200 plus city services for all the citizen to government interaction. It's a BSD licensed open source service, and they are in active work right now to help build a community around it and try to scale it to other cities globally. And all of the actions and all of the issues that we've talked about here really come into play when Paris built it for themselves, but now, and it's a decently great MVP for that. How do you then scale it when you have to deal with other people in terms of how do you get interoperability in terms of data sovereignty? How do you get interoperability in terms of identity? So we have an event coming up where we're bringing people together for that, and it seemed like a good opportunity to start talking about these issues in Portland and in Baltimore, and wherever we can start getting the word out.
Is this effort building its own community? A new community, or is it going to join an existing?
I think that's still open to discussion right now. It's a very mature software base. Mm-hmm. It's the first time that a city of that size has made this type of investment, and now the community is kind of not an afterthought, but this is where they are in the progression, and it's kind of new of what's the best strategy. And I think they're still we're still learning what might be the best strategy.
Yeah. Is there any similarity with Digitel in Tel Aviv that Zohar Sharon has done?
I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay. That one was more to engage the public and to get them to appreciate the services that the city's providing. And they have something like 70% adoption by residents in Tel Aviv into this system.
Yeah, there's a number of these types of systems that it just seems like it's not appropriate for our commons to dictate which system to use. It's more of be a great place for us to come together and say, here are the systems. Let's try to scale the ones that just like the Linux Foundation picks and chooses and has some common reference sets, but anyone is free to do with it what they want, to really give some clarity, to start highlighting some of these systems that have really started, that are maybe scale ready or could be scaled with not a huge amount of work, but they're pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, maybe the way to, because that's a really good question, Scott. I think the main objective of this is to try and avoid fragmentation between the cities. And so, what the Linux Foundation is doing, what Eclipse is doing, what OMG is doing, right? We don't want the cities to be confused, which I think they are today very much, right? They don't know what step to take that's not going to take them down a blind alley in the long term. They're starting to realize this is quite a complex space, and they don't want, a series of companies coming in and telling them how the other companies are bad, right? Which is a tendency we all have, right? My stuff's better than their stuff, go this way, because it just confuses them and will slow the market down. So I think what we would like to do is to bring all, if possible, all, or at least as many of those groups together and say, we do not want to confuse the cities. If we confuse them, we will slow the market down. We will make it bad for all of the providers here. What we want is to make sure that there's a minimum core interoperability, like a GTFS layer, that is community developed, is global, and then you should be able to sell all of your high value services on top of that in a way that is interoperable, and the cities are not stuck locked into various kinds of, walled garden. Anybody who has, contacts in any of these groups, if they can promote what we're doing here and start to say, at least come to this group meeting. Let's talk about the minimum things we have to do collectively. So as all the great work that's going on individually is at least interoperable. I think that's the core return from this group.
I missed it. I'm sorry. What was the name of that effort in Paris?
Lutis, I just put it in the chat window.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Well, I've used up everybody's time here. This was great. Thanks, John, so much for kicking us off on that. I thought it was really a great way to start it. And we've still got several more time slots. I don't have the speaker nailed down for next time, but it'll probably either be Eclipse or a Splunk. I'm working on just figuring out who's available to do that, but it'll be in 2 weeks from now. And I will post the audio for this right after the meeting as soon as I can get it downloaded. Thanks, everybody. Great meeting. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Will.
Thanks.